Recording started.
Hey everybody, I want to welcome you to this week's Matrexit discussion group call, as in Exiting the Matrix for Tactical Sovereignty. And this is, I believe, July 17, 2022. Like I always say, beautiful Sunday, first day of the week, not the 7th, and therefore not the Sabbath. Tonight I want to talk a little bit about our servitude, the position of slavery that people find themselves in. And I think everybody is at different levels of that. I don't think there's just one single level, just like, with sovereignty. You look at the word closely related to it, which is suzerainty. And suzerainty, that shows you basically the different levels of sovereignty, for instance. You look, for instance, at like a sovereign nation, okay? But underneath them, there's also going to be different levels of it. You've got the state within a nation. It has a level of sovereignty, but it also has some allegiance still to the state. And the same thing as you go down the line and look at the county level, look at the city level, look at the mayor for a town. There's a level of sovereignty there, but there's other allegiances also in place that have to be yielded to. And the same aspect applies as well regarding people's servitude or slavery, for instance. We know about the Emancipation Proclamation of Lincoln in 1863. That's pretty well known. But it didn't really, even at that time, if you look at what was going on, it didn't really release everybody. It was only applied to certain peoples. And it depended on the state you were in, how close maybe you were even bordering the Union states. And even after that, the things that people think of as slavery at that time, I don't think were near as harsh as what's been depicted. We know that many of the soldiers for the South were black Confederate soldiers. And there's no way in the world that a farmer who has been, beating, torturing, misusing, whatever, his slaves for a number of years, having children by them, you name it, would one day, turn to the slave and say, hey, here's a weapon, here's ammo, I need you to go fight for the South. Well, if things were as horrible as it's been alluded to believe, I think the first thing that slave would do is he would say, gee, thanks. He would load the weapon and point it at the plantation owner and gain his own freedom immediately right then. And so I don't think it was near as harsh. If you want to really see the harsh things that occurred, it happened after that time, after 1865, 66, 67, with some of the other laws that were put in place. Where it was Black Code or the Sundown Law. There was things there that were far worse and actually legalized slavery and legalized people's servitude, whether voluntary or involuntary servitude. If somebody, for instance, under some of those laws was to get in trouble for a crime, they could have a plantation owner step forward and pay their way out of it. That way they wouldn't be going to prison. But at the same time, they would have to go and work for that plantation owner for whatever ascribed amount of time that the contract, keyword contract, stated, for them to, get let out of that court case, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. But at the same time, even if that didn't occur, then that meant that they were going to be going to a state. I don't know if rural federal penitentiaries had been created yet at that time, because the federal government was just kind of getting rolling. But even whatever prison sentence they had would involve some amount of servitude. So it was kind of a matter of, well, who do you want to work for? Do you want to have a semi-free life, and have this plantation owner buy you out of the court case, or and do you want to go to prison and be 100% completely, you know, at the whims of the state? So I think that era in U.S. history is worth further exploration for people. And it's not really exactly the way it was portrayed. But though it does give us an example as to things that would happen in the future and things that would be instated in the future. That those ideas were not things at the time of slavery that were just dreamt up by plantation owners. This was all well-established doctrine. The so-called, we think of like the Happy Pilgrims coming here on the Mayflower, and sitting around a bunch of picnic tables with some indigenous Americans, and learning how to plant corn and all that kind of thing, and having a hunky-dory life. That wasn't really the case. You didn't get a free ride. Nobody rides for free in any situation in life. And anybody coming here by ship, whether they came, like most of them did, originally from the Dutch Netherlands, or they actually did come from England or Ireland, as many of them also came from, that boat ride wasn't free. They were either going to owe the master of the ship, or they were going to owe whoever was financing that trip. So the USA was established by people that were indentured servants. They had to come, and they held the land by grant, by deed from the king. He was still in charge, and they were expected to better the land, just like a trust situation. The trustees are expected to maintain the trust and even leave it in better condition when they leave as trustee than when they stepped in. Same exact situation here with these indentured servants. They had to better the land and plant crops on the land, and they were selling those crops normally back to England. But whatever profits were coming off from that land, a big chunk of it was going towards the king. That was really the start of the Revolutionary War. It wasn't that everybody all got together and decided they didn't want to be under the British Crown anymore, which incidentally, this territory up through the east coast of the US and up into Canada was actually named British North America. And I think the name of that land just kind of fizzled out of history and just wasn't used quite as much as time went on. But I don't think anything has ever really changed regarding British North America. But these people at the end of their tenure as indentured servitude, when they came here, then they had a choice at the end of, normally it was 7 years. They could either pay their way out of future servitude, or they could renegotiate that servitude. They had ways of exiting it. But those were the same exact principles that were used later on with the slaves. Now, whether, the slaves came from Africa, which the out of Africa theory promotes, and I'm not really very keen on, or it came from people in South America, or these slaves came from what would make more sense, the people that were already here. This land, it's not like nobody lived here. We all know about the native indigenous people who had lived here. And to me, it would make more sense really to pull your workers from that sector of people. There's writings by Benjamin Franklin, actually, I read, thinking back on this now, and he was talking about the people here in British North America as compared to the people that came over from Europe. And he even said that in difference from the people from Europe, the people that were here already, he referred to them as tawny or dark. And that's what tawny means. It means dark complected. And if you look into old photos from way back then, actually, these people that you're seeing depicted as slaves, they look very, very much like the old photos that you'll find of the native North Americans, which I find kind of curious. And to me, it just doesn't make sense to go several thousand miles to another continent to bring people over on a dangerous boat trip and an expensive boat trip at that, when you've already got people right here. It just makes zero sense, especially considering that these slaves, you know, I'm sorry that they aren't out there in the field, you know, picking cotton all day, every day, year round. It's just not the way crops work. At first they would have been planted and then maintained for a few months and then picked later on and harvested. So it's not like there's an around the clock, necessarily around the clock job, just for working the fields alone. So this whole idea I'm showing regarding the servitude or involuntary servitude isn't anything new. This has been going on for years and years. It even goes back into um, biblical times. If you look at scripture, the God of the Old Testament even pretty much says it's okay to have slaves. Just don't beat them too hard. Is basically what's said. Although I don't think you find a whole lot of mention regarding that from the New Testament God. Well, that's a story for another day. I think this topic is something that's really interesting that we don't really examine ourselves enough. And I was recommended by somebody to talk on this because, there's so many things that for me are just like in my head, stuff I know, just basic stuff, but it isn't that basic to a lot of other people. There are ideas and theologies or doctrines that other people really haven't explored, and people don't really explore things until they're brought to light. And so that's really what this is for this evening. And this is something just for us to stop and consider and look at different aspects of our life and find, where we've indentured ourselves. I mentioned that word contract earlier. And everybody is at different levels regarding their voluntary or involuntary servitude, depending on the contracts they've signed. Some people are way more contracted in than others, and some people aren't contracted in very much at all. I find one of the writings that is probably the most fascinating to look at comes from John Locke. That's the Locke with an E on the end, Locke. And many people, if they recall that name, he's thought of as, say, a founding father. But technically, he really wasn't a founding father. He passed away in, I think it was around 1704, 1705. So he spent most of his life in the, all of his life really within the 17th century, the 1640s, 1650s, and did a lot of his writings around 1680. And he wrote quite a bit on this servitude and our right to enter into this servitude. One of the documents, it's really made up of two, that I recommend. One of the books from him is Two Treatises of Government. The Two Treatises of Government, very, very interesting read. And what he lays out there is something that I think we've seen evidence of the past several weeks with the change of the Roe versus Wade decision. And this goes exactly to the things that he talked about. I know that after the case was accepted, Will showed me some of his documents that were going to be presented to the Supreme Court for the case. And in reading those, the principles went along in line very closely with John Locke and with the ideas that he brought forward in his writings. his essential concept was that, you know, if there is, and this is kind of contingent on what he says, if there was no firm government established or judicial system established, then it was okay for you to punish somebody regarding a crime, like even defending yourself. If somebody, you needed to fire on somebody, but if you could take their life, though, and that was a right thing to do to defend yourself, then it would also be okay for you to take their time. The number one commodity we all have, our time, and to put them into servitude to pay off whatever debt for something that they had done previously. John Locke's basic concept really was what authority we have over our bodies. Do we even have the authority to give our bodies over into servitude, even if it's voluntary? Do our bodies belong to us? You know, a lot of what I'm saying here is going to get into maybe a spiritual, or some people might think religious kind of idea. And if you haven't come to the point, if you haven't accepted that there is a God or a higher design yet, then maybe this discussion won't be for you. Um, but like I said, if you haven't discovered that yet, because the time will come when you do discover it, and chances are will be during your time here on planet Earth. Like the old saying goes, there's no atheist in foxholes. When things get really, really bad, what do people do? They immediately get on their knees and pray. When things are going horrible in their life and that they think they're going the wrong direction, need to make some changes, what do? They go to church. What do a lot of prisoners do while they're incarcerated? Many of them look for comfort and turn to the Bible and turn to the scriptures and really start learning a lot about life just from the scriptures themselves. And speaking of prisoners, we have to realize also, though, that the reason why somebody is there in that situation is out of their consent and out of contracts that they've entered into. And brings back the idea again from John Locke. Do we really have the authority over our body to give it over to somebody else? I would say no. The creator, whoever it is, the intelligent design, whatever you want to call that entity, definitely has more power and more authority over our bodies than we even have ourselves. And like I said, that can be seen very often. Somebody gets sick, or they're told they're going to die. I mean, all of a sudden, people have a way of becoming extremely religious. All of a sudden, innately, we know in ourselves, we know in our subconscious where this authority lies at, who has the power. And so what do? We turn to that entity. And I think one of the interesting things I find regarding slavery is that historically, the United States of America is touted for ending it in the 1860s, when ending slavery really was not a new idea at all. It had been done 60 years earlier by the country of Haiti. Haiti had always, being an island country, had always had problems with invaders and people coming in and putting them into servitude. And when they were dealing with that, I mean, that's where the first French Revolution came. It was really in Haiti. And they wrote their own constitution at that time and outlawed slavery. So they did it long before the USA did. So I think these things really need to weigh heavily on our heart, because whoever you're in service to, whoever you're indentured to, that these things really show through your physical actions or even the actions of your autograph or signature where your loyalty lies. It really shows who you are serving. Uh, Too many people often stop and, when it comes to things being right or wrong, you know, they immediately go to, oh, is this legal or illegal? They ask that question before they ask whether something is truly right or wrong at a spiritual level. Even I would say just a common sense level, because most people should still have a conscience intact, and your conscience, that still small voice in your head, that tells you either way, whether something is truly right or wrong. It's not a matter of legal or illegal. People who follow that train of thought of something being legal or illegal, um, wow, bad things result from that. Uh, Look at many of the major things that have happened to people through history. And it's always been because there's the bootlickers there, the people who have given their service to a entity of mankind, rather than to their spiritual creator, where the real power lies at. If the spiritual creator wanted to end everything with a snap of the fingers, he could end everything with a snap of the fingers. Because essentially, everything was started with a snap of the fingers. Whether you want to call that creation or whether you want to call it the Big Bang, whatever he used, that's where the real power lays at. And so we have to look at the different things in our life, the different contracts that we've indentured ourselves to, and make a decision of what we're giving up. Because this all comes down to not just our property or our rights, because there's two different types of rights. I think, and these don't get identified enough by people, but the two basic types of rights that we have are intangible rights, the stuff that you can't taste, touch, or feel, and then your tangible rights, which would be like physical property, a car, something like that, which falls into the right of use or usufruct, like Boris talks about. And so with every little contract we enter into, and as I said before, that we have to realize anytime that a signature is required for anything, the only reason why it's required is because there is a contract in place somewhere. Bottom line, if there was no contract involved, that signature wouldn't be needed. But anytime you can look at different situations where a signature or autograph is required, you're always going to find a contract laying somewhere in the background, something that you are agreeing to. Maybe inadvertently, you may not totally realize it, but there's something in place. I had an interesting experience one time. I stopped by a Department of Motor Vehicles, and I asked the lady at the counter, I said, when I or anyone else signs that driver's license, when we affix our autograph to it, I said, we're agreeing to a set of laws. We're becoming contractually obligated. I said, is that correct? And she said, well, yeah, actually, that's true. I said, good. I said, now, if somebody were to ask you before they sign if those laws or this contract can be shown to them, what do you have to show to people? And she got kind of puzzled and was like, well, we don't really have anything here, but I think you can look up statutes online, And I was like, yeah, you can look up statutes online. In fact, I even told her the code for Florida, where people could go look in case anybody ever asked her that question. But step by step, and the driver's license is probably one of the bigger ones that comes to everybody's mind regarding contractual obligations. But when we really stop and think about all the different times that we've signed things or even shown our agreement through our performance, stopped and thought about that and start seeing all the little tiny ways that you've agreed to this slavery. Even if it is voluntary, it's still slavery. Bottom line, it just has a nicer name to it. You know, it's like when the founders were trying to decide on the population of the USA. Well, all of these guys, including I believe the first 7 of the first 8 U.S. presidents, were all British subjects. They were still British subjects. And so, yeah, were they operating treasonously towards Britain? I'd say you could say yes. Or maybe they were doing this exactly the way Britain and France wanted it to be done. But even those guys were still British subjects. And so they, debated about what kind of language they would use regarding the inhabitants in the USA. And they decided to go back to an old Roman word, of course, because they're still following Roman systems of government. Go back to an old Roman word and use the word citizen, because citizen sounded a lot softer. It sounded a lot nicer than the word subject. Something maybe more digestible for people, if they were going to claim citizenship rather than saying that they're a subject of the Queen or a subject of the King or a subject to U.S. Inc., whatever the case might be. I just thought citizen sounded nicer. But that doesn't change the situation. Citizen and subject are synonymous with each other. They mean the same exact thing. So they're going to constantly try and make whatever situation you're involved in, whatever contractual obligation you get involved in, they want to make it seem as palatable as possible and as easy for you, at least in your own good conscience, to accept. But like Shakespeare said, uh, a rose by any other name is still a rose, right? And this is the same exact situation here. So I think we should pay a little closer attention to our lives. Do a study on this. It's not hard to find the writings of John Locke. Go and look him up or read what he was writing about. The things he was writing about and the language that he used. In fact, he used 3 basic rights that everybody had, and included in that was the right to property. They were just mimicking him when they wrote the Constitution, but they omitted that word property and put in the pursuit of happiness instead. So you had the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because we all know in a socialist state, even in soft socialism, all ownership lies with the state, bottom line. So, I mean, that's just one example how they just kind of started softening things and making things more palatable and easier for people to accept. And I don't remember, I can't really pronounce the guy's name. He said that the easiest one to enslave is the one that thinks they're free. Absolutely. I mean, growing up, how often have we heard, proud to be American, where at least I know I'm free. You're constantly told how free you are and of all your freedoms. Well, stop and look at a lot of those freedoms. Those freedoms exist because you've contractually obligated yourself in giving up some of yourself. I would say that the only word really better to suit this, away from slavery without using the word slavery, a more appropriate word would be fornication, because that's exactly what fornication is. It's the giving over of the body. And that's what people have done. They've fornicated themselves to the state or whatever entity. We're brought up believing or being told in church, or the case may be, that, adultery is sex before marriage, and that I mean, adultery is cheating, rather cheating on somebody after marriage, but that fornication would be sex before marriage. And it's interesting is we're told that, in churchianity today, but if you go back to the scriptures that they're supposedly teaching from, look up some of the marriages. Look up the marriage with Abraham. Did they get married? Him and Sarah get married? No, he took her into the tent as a wife. They consummated their agreement, and boom, they were married. You're not going to find all these stories of marriages. I mean, Adam and Eve, were they married? There's a question. But you're not going to find these marriages as we think of them today, that's pushed by the church today. You're not even going to find those in the scripture. And that's probably one of the bigger contracts that people indenture themselves into, is that marriage contract. They're putting themselves in a situation of being in a marriage bond rather than just an agreement between two people, maternity. You know what I mean? That's what it's really supposed to be. Everything lays at the heart of contract, and that's the same thing with marriage. It's just an agreement between two people and their God. It's supposed to be a covenant, technically, not even a contract. It's a covenant because it's made with your creator. But what people know of as marriage today is now going and filing paperwork down at the county courthouse and getting the marriage license. This is just an example of how they take things one little step at a time. And so now if there's a problem within that union, instead of it being settled between them, or even say even people in the church helping them, whatever the case may be, instead what do? They run back to where they applied for that license at, to get married. What's a license in any situation? It's, putting in a request to participate in licentious behavior. And there you go. But look at all these little different contracts, different little things that we agree to or indenture ourselves to. Because what's really happening is that you're giving up some of your rights. You're giving up some of the authority that was given to you by the creator, or by, the intelligent design, however you want to term it. Those are things you're born with. And step by step through life, what does man want to do? Man wants to go and usurp those rights, control those rights, and keep you in perpetual slavery. Whether it's called indentured servitude or voluntary slavery, it doesn't matter. It's all the same. And I think I'm just going to end with that. This is part of what I tell people every week that I close with, is learn who you really are, where you're really from, and where you're really at. And this falls under the learn who you really are category. I remember whenever I would leave home as a teenager or younger, leave the house to go stay at a friend's house or go on a trip or a weekend somewhere, whatever the case was, that my earthly father, my dad, would always say to me, he'd say, Brian, don't forget who you belong to. And he didn't mean that I belong to him or I belong to the Parker family. No, he meant the creator. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that mankind has today, and always puts them in a horrible, horrible position, is that they've forgotten who they really belong to. Till next Sunday night, catch you later, guys. Have a great week. And like I said, don't forget who you belong to.